Good evening, everyone. My name's John Shaw. I'm the chairman of YAYAS, the Yorkshire Architectural and York Archaeological Society, and I'm here really to welcome tonight's speaker, Ian Tempest. I've known Ian for a few years, mainly through YAYAS, but also he and I are both voluntary guides to the City of York, and I can see some fellow guides and past and present and future guides, I hope, in the waiting room there. So without further ado, a few housekeeping things. We are recording the lecture, not your comments and not your pictures, just the lecture for our website, so you can stream it afterwards and catch up with it later if you don't make it, and forward it to your friends. And if you want to ask Ian some questions, if you use the chat facility at the bottom of your screen, it is for most people at the bottom of the screen, you can leave Ian your questions in the chat and he'll pick up some of the questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll leave you with tonight's speaker, Ian Tempest. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I hope everyone can hear me. So my name's Ian Tempest. I worked for 30 years for City of York Council, particularly in economic development and tourism. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the history of some of York's hotels, going back quite a few years, as well as some of the more recent hotels as well. The point is that tourism is a big industry in York. But people often think it's just a modern feature. And obviously it does have a huge impact on York in recent times, but there's actually a long history of tourism and of other visits to York. So we're going to explore some of these right now. So here's some examples of some of York's hotels, because the talk is really going to be looking at staying visitors, the people who come to York, well, of course, until recently, in increasing numbers, staying overnight in the many hotels that exist in the city. So here's a chance to look at some hotels, and as I say, ancient and modern. Just to start with some key modern tourism facts. This is obviously before the pandemic, which has had a major impact on tourism and obviously on the entirety of life in York and everywhere. But in 2018, York had over 8 million visitors. Over 700,000 millions of pounds was spent by those visitors, and over 24,000 jobs were created. Basically, about 1 in 5 of the people working in York are associated with tourism or retail or allied businesses like that. So a major impact on York, in York's economy. Of those 8 million visitors, about 1.5 million stayed overnight in 2018, but it turned out that over half the spend of all the visitors to York are the staying visitors. They are extremely important to the York economy, and more than outweigh the importance of the day visitor. And so that's why I wanted to do a presentation on the hotel side of York, because it's extremely important to York's economy. So a wee bit about the history of tourism in York. And obviously there's an image of York Market, and indeed it is markets and fairs. That's one of the reasons why visitors come to York in the past as well as in the present day. But obviously travel back in, say, pre-1700, I would say, was extremely hard. There was very limited road travel. It was either by horse or on foot. The conditions of the roads were poor. There were few signs. There was little information and few maps. And the majority of the population had a very narrow horizons and would be looking really only at their local community. But all the same, for centuries, York Minster has undoubtedly been a draw, even back in the dim and distant past. And obviously York Minster, the current York Minster, dates from 1220 through to 1470. That were the years it was built. But there were previous York Minsters before then, and there's always been a sort of sequence of pilgrims and others coming to York for religious reasons. But travel in historical times was, as I say, very challenging. The wonderful image of Dawn French from the Vicar of Dibley is basically a summary of what a lot of the roads used to be like back in the dim and distant past. The mighty horse in the middle is exactly how other people travelled. Though, remember, the majority of people would literally be walking on foot to get around the place. And the picture on the right is not, in fact, from York, but it's an example of pilgrims on horseback. Despite the challenges, though, people were coming to York. And I'm talking here from around about the period 1200 onwards. So what sort of people were they? There were certainly pilgrims who were coming to the Minster and also to St Mary's Abbey. There would be a substantial number of people involved with royal visits, and York was blessed with a lot of royal visits, right the way, certainly from 1066-67 onwards. Sometimes they were coming to conquer, like William the Conqueror, but a lot of the time they were here for other celebrations, and royal visits brought a large entourage with them, and they all needed to be put up in the city. There were also others, merchants, traders, etc., and other visitors, and they would be local people, regional and from overseas as well. Other visitors to York would come associated with the fairs and markets, as I said earlier. There'd of course be families visiting friends and relatives, and there were the mystery plays, the great institution of religious plays that were certainly popular in York and would have brought people from far and wide. Where did people stay in the past, say from 1200 onwards? I would say there are three groups of places where folks stayed: in inns, taverns and hostelries, in other words, in, if you like, accommodation, proper accommodation, staying with friends and family, or sometimes in staying in substantial residences, very big places. The inns, taverns and hostelries, that became quite an important tradition. Traditionally, travellers stayed overnight in many of the monasteries along the way, but their numbers became so great that monks could no longer cope with the numbers. And so enterprising locals set up private inns. In 1301, the York Civic Ordinances identified hostelers as those businesses that take in strangers and who rent out houses, rooms, stalls, or other accommodation. I should say that accommodation needed two things. They needed accommodation for the people, and in many cases they needed accommodation for the horses. So the stabling of horses was an extremely important matter. And in fact, in the civic ordinances, there was a charge of 1/2 of an old penny for stabling a horse for the night, and a penny a night for the guest, for the bedroom, for the bed and for the room. So these were all civic ordinances. The king in the painting is, I think, one of the Edwards, Edward the First or Second, around the year 1301. The hostelers and taverners were organised into trades guilds, and in fact, hostelers were responsible for performing one of the plays in the mystery play cycle. So there's a connection with the photograph I put up earlier. The image on the right is of the Golden Fleece, which is a pub, which was in fact an inn at one stage, a medieval inn, as early as 1503, although it became an inn properly from about 1656. It's on the road of the Pavement, and businessmen from all over the country would travel to York, and board and lodge in places like the Golden Fleece, stabling their horses next door. Those of you from York will know Lady Peckett's Yard. Well, apparently there were stables in there. And it was associated with the wool trade, hence the image of the Golden Fleece as the above the pub today. Other places were where friends and family would stay. And there's a couple of places in York that meet the bill of the Middle Ages from about 1300 to 1400 onwards. So, for example, Ladies' Row in Goodramgate is a surviving row of houses built in 1316, and they would certainly have welcomed guests in some of those properties. And also in the Black Swan, Peasholm Green. This is now a pub, but was originally built in 1417 as the home of an MP, William Bowes, the Lord Mayor of York at the time, and the plaque on the wall of the pub survives. But this is exactly the sort of place where people would stay with people who had large enough properties in the city. The other area where people would be staying would be in the bigger substantial residences. For example, York Castle, where kings would settle. Also, the kings would settle in the Franciscan friary that was next door to York Castle. This is the model of York Castle, which you can see today inside Clifford's Tower. Another place where which would certainly have welcomed visitors over the centuries is the King's Manor, built originally around 1270 as the home of the Abbot of St Mary's Abbey. It would certainly have been accommodation for guests of the abbot, and later on was certainly a accommodation which was used in 1541 after the dissolution of the monasteries, when no less a figure than Henry VIII came to York and stayed at the King's Manor, as it's now called, formerly the house of the Abbot of St Mary's, and he brought an entourage of some 5,000 people with him in 1541. So that's the sort of scale of the operation of a royal visit, substantial in nowadays, and it was even more substantial in many ways in the past. One curiosity when it comes to working out where people stayed in the Middle Ages is the hospitium, which is the property in the museum gardens, which was associated with St Mary's Abbey. Current thinking suggests that the hospitium, although the name hospitium implies hospitality, may well have been little more than a warehouse or storage space associated with the wharf along the River Ouse that backed onto this place back in the Middle Ages. I still think that there is every prospect that some people would have stayed here, but as I say, it did have more of a business and industrial use, certainly for a considerable period of time. Moving on to Tudor and 17th century York, we start to get some statistics and numbers, and those who know me know I like the numbers. In 1537, there were over 1,000 beds available for strangers to York in the city and in the suburbs. And obviously that included also extra space kept by merchants for their friends, which added to another 200, 300 beds. There was stabling for over 1,700 horses in 1537. So obviously York was expected to be busy with people coming, but obviously on horseback and bringing themselves to the city. The inn holders became a very important industry for York and for the region, becoming more of a respectable occupation as more folk were travelling, there was more internal trade and the rise of fairs. From 1578, all the inn holders were expected to provide at least 6 beds for guests. And the banner at the bottom, for those of you who are from York will be familiar with that, that relates to the pub called the Old Star Inn on Stonegate, first licensed in 1644. They had rooms and stables at the time. Next off is Georgian York, and we'll start to get to some, if you like, proper hotels in a moment. In the Georgian period, the 18th century, York was a very strong destination for the well-to-do and became a social centre for the north of England. The photograph is of the assembly rooms, but also in Georgian York, you'd have the Theatre Royal. Racing became extremely popular, and the previous image of people walking in a promenade along the New Walk Terrace by the River Ouse. But also in Georgian York, as well as York's fantastic assets and interest as a place for visitors, it became a little bit more easy to travel. There were significant travelling improvements, and particular turnpike roads where there was actual investment in the roads, getting better than the Dawn French photograph earlier, but also the start of a significant grouping of coaching inns. This extraordinary process of basically a relay of horses and carriages that would be taking people across the country from, for example, London to York, as in the poster. That was in 1706. There's a copy of this poster in the Castle Museum. 4-day coach journey from London to York that would travel to the Black Swan in Coney Street in York. If God permits. That's a warning that, of course, travelling was still hazardous. You'd still have problems of the roads getting flooded. The exciting problems, of course, occasionally of highwaymen, but other challenges. But all the same, you start to get a network of these stage coaches and coaching inns, which develops further as time goes on. There were also improvements to information, newspapers, timetables, all sorts of other innovations, which generally made travelling easier, but still probably not for the great majority who would not be able to travel far, because of course there would be costs involved in all these transports, and there would be, you know, a considerable sum for those on, you know, barely subsistence pay in those days. This is a sort of montage of a number of different features. The image on the left is a painting of the Black Swan and some of the horses galloping along there. Frankly, I love all this chaos that there must have been hundreds of years ago with the stagecoaches. The noise must have been unbelievable. The smell, of course, from all the horses and their if you like, their byproducts would have been quite sensational too. On the top right of this picture, there's a plaque about the George Inn, which was in Coney Street, and this plaque is still visible today. This was an important hostelry, and again, horse-drawn coaches would be bringing people to it. The steps on the bottom left of this photograph are outside the old White Swan. It's a set of mounting steps to enable people to climb into the coach. Because obviously, as you can see from the photograph on the right, there's quite a step up from the ground level to get inside the coach. That picture on the right, by the way, I took only a couple of years ago, and it was during filming of the television series Gentleman Jack. The first series included many scenes in York, and they've been back recently, obviously following social distancing processes. So it looks as though there's going to be a second series of Gentleman Jack on the BBC, probably later this year. And so finally, to get round to an example of a pub with a very colourful history. This one's called the York Tavern. It was built in 1770. Several old cottages were demolished to create it, and it's in St Helens Square. For those of you who are from York or know York, it's basically on the site where Betty's is today. But obviously, Betty's is in a comparatively new building. This one dates from 1770. York Tavern was a really important coaching inn. It had massive stables connected with it. 130 to 150 horses were stored in those stables. And the tavern was a big operation. There was a coach operation, and the post office was nearby as well. So, you know, you can see this was a hive of activity, as you can tell from the lithograph on the top left corner. It was originally called York Tavern, but it became known as Harker's after the landlord was replaced in 1850 by Christopher Harker, a former butler, who and the hotel kept his name after he died in 1870. Later on, the hotel was demolished in the late 1920s, and the tenants, though, moved to Tadcaster Road and created a new hotel there, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute or two. As I say, the site was eventually swept away and is now where Betty's Tea Rooms are at St Helens Square. Moving on to pre-Victorian York, you've got the mail coaches. The stagecoach system becomes more and more regularized. Mail coaches obviously bringing goods and parcels and letters, as well as people from all over the country. And it was a substantially important network from about 1780 to around about 1840. The coaches, by the way, got larger too. The passengers would have to sit on the top deck of the coach, not just inside the coach itself. Mind you, the passengers on the top deck paid only half price because they would, of course, got very heavily rained upon. For a brief period, there was an important transport through packet steamers along the Ouse from York to Hull and thence on to London. Other aspects of Victorian York attracted people too. There was this interest in learning. Organisations like the Yorkshire Philosophical Society and indeed ourselves, YAYAS, were founded around about this time. And the Yorkshire Museum was established with its interest in fossils, geology, astronomy too. There was a major music festival in York which ran for several years in the 1820s. And I suppose above all, there was the centre of gravity of the hotels in the city centre. At the bottom of the page is the photograph from the 1840s of what was Lop Lane. It's now been much more widened out in front of York Minster. The building on the right, sticking out into the street, was Ettridge's, originally called Blewett's, which was an important hotel, also a coaching inn, but their stables were across the road, more or less where the library is today. But that was, Ettridge's was an important and very, I suppose, glamorous hotel in many respects. But it lost out later on in the 1850s when the railways came along and things started to change more substantially. Hence, we move on to other parts of Victorian York. York as a major railway manufacturing centre, chocolate manufacturer, and business travel became important, as well as the leisure visitors, as the railways started to catch hold. Bottom right, you've got a picture of the original Rowntree's factory on the River Ouse, which of course is now where Nestle are, up at Haxby, on Haxby Road. So business travel important, but more and more visitors were coming to York as well as leisure travel expanded with the development of the railway industry. I love this poster of the excursion train gallop, it's called, because it obviously reflects third-class passengers who had no roof on their carriages. They were basically just wagons that would be taking people, obviously attached to the various steam trains that were ploughing through the countryside, and certainly from York from 1839, when the first rail services started, York began to grow as a major visitor destination for a whole new group of people. And that led to the creation of railway hotels as well. On the left-hand side of this photograph is one called Scorwins, originally George Britain's railway hotel, which opened in 1841. Sarah Scorwin, a businesswoman, and took over the hotel from 1842, and it remained in her name for a good 50 plus years, although she'd passed away long before then. It was later demolished for the creation of the northeast headquarters of the railway company. But Scorwin's was an important hotel with over 80 bedrooms. As I say, built 1842 onwards. The picture on the right is another hotel created in 1855. It was called Wynn's George Hotel, and the address is 37 Tanner Row. Later tenant of it was a guy called John Holliday, who used to work at the Royal Station Hotel, which I'll highlight in a minute or two. This building was also later taken over by the North Eastern Railway, and today it's the offices, or the regional office of Historic England, who obviously ought to be in historic premises, and that certainly is. It's a magnificent looking building on Tanner Row. Some statistics here on passenger and train service numbers. Going back to the coaching days, in the 1830s, 23,000 coach passengers came to and from London to York. Just 30 years later, there were nearly 350,000 rail passengers doing the same journey. And the train services to York Station expanded massively to nearly 300 services a day by 1898. The photograph in the picture is York Station in the 1880s. This is the what became the new York Station compared to the older York Station, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. A quick look at the station hotels. Because having talked about railway hotels that were near the station, here are two that actually were associated directly with the railway stations. The one on the left, Royal Station Hotel, was opened in 1853. The one on the right was opened in 1878. We'll talk about them in a bit more detail. So the Royal Station Hotel opened 1853 and is associated with I suppose the original York Railway Station, which opened in 1841. It was built across, designed by G.T. Andrews, the architect of the railway station itself. And the hotel had been commissioned by the directors of the railway companies. G.T. Andrews was paid a fixed commission of £300 for the work. And it became a hotel, but only for about 25 years, because later on, the railway company realized that the terminus station that they had was not sufficient, and they needed a much, much larger railway station, and hence created the one that we see today. So this building closed as a hotel around about 1878 and became part of the North Eastern Rail offices, along with those other former hotels that also got converted into offices. These particular offices, I think, closed about 15 years ago, and it's now part of the main council offices since 2013. This is an image showing in blue, the coaching inns were, the main coaching inns that I've mentioned. So you've got at the top, you've got the York Tavern or Harker's, and you've got the other two on Coney Street, which is the George and the Black Swan, just next to it. But the centre of gravity of all the hotels moved across the river when you've got the railway hotels coming up. So you've got 37 Tanner Row, you've got the Scorwins Hotel, and you've got the hotel I've just mentioned, the Royal Station Hotel. So this is the new York Railway Station. As I say, that opened in 1877. And that's a picture I only took very recently. And obviously you've got the same wonderful roof that we saw in the 1880 photograph just a few moments ago. So the station hotel here was also called the York Station Hotel, sometimes called the Royal York Hotel. It's now part of the Principals Group. It's a 5-story building, opened in 1878, and the architect was William Peachey of the North Eastern Railway. He was in turn one of the architects, along with Thomas Prosser, of the main railway station itself. But I think Prosser had left before the Royal Station Hotel was completed. So this was a flagship hotel with 100 bedrooms, a flagship hotel of the North Eastern Railway Company, later renamed, as I say, the Royal York. The building's fantastic inside as well. And I'm going to say later, I do encourage, especially those of you from York itself, to have a look at some of these hotels. Do pop in, have a tea or coffee, and I'm sure you'll be able to see some of the interesting features of some of these great historic hotels. Principals, I think, took over the hotel in 2013, and it now has 164 rooms and suites, and of course also extensive conference facilities as well. One of the great hotels in York. So moving on to the early 20th century, tourism in York starts to grow more and more. You've got more festivals and attractions, including the Railway Museum, the early take-up of cars, motor cars, although the take-up was greater after 1930. New shops, cafes and public transport, all growing in the city. Before we look at some of the other hotels, it's worth pointing out that I'm mainly showcasing some of the most attractive or important historically hotels. But in fact, there were an awful lot of other hotels in York that were commercial hotels, really aimed at business and commercial travellers, traders, etc. This one, the Old George, lasted for almost 200 years. And was an important hotel for a lot of people at one stage, with 20 bedrooms, I think. It was demolished in 1850 in the creation of the Stone Bow, quite a famous, even some people notorious road in York that was created in the 1950s. Also important at one time or another were so-called temperance hotels. There was a strong temperance movement in the Victorian times to wean people off alcohol. So there would be temperance hotels established, not just in York, but at all sorts of different places. But I guess York, with its Quaker traditions, the temperance hotel movement must have been quite interesting at one point. I want to talk briefly about a relatively small hotel, which became a hotel in the 1930s. And I suppose at that time, funnily enough, although I say it's a small hotel, would have been quite significant at the time. It was originally a house built in 1876, and it's called the Priory Hotel. It's on Fulford Road in York. It was built apparently as a wedding present and was originally called the Manor House. The name was changed to Priory House in 1905, and it became the Priory Hotel in 1930. At the bottom left of the photograph, you'll see two arches. These are from the original York Theatre Royal, which went a facelift in 1876, and somehow or other, the original owners of the Manor House, I guess, bought the stonework from the Theatre Royal, and they've been moved into the garden of the hotel. The hotel was expanded over several decades, and I think has now got more bedrooms than it originally started. I'm not sure of the current status of the hotel, though. There was talk that the business might be being sold, but it certainly was a significant hotel on the Fulford Road for quite some time, from the 1930s. Looking at tourism in the mid-century, two pictures here. The picture on the left is of the massive queue of people waiting to go into the Castle Museum in the heart of the Eye of York in 1938. And this, like the Railway Museum, is a good example of the development of museums in York in the early part of the 20th century. There was also certainly some significant hotel expansion and the growth of a number of parks and gardens, also to add to the attractiveness of the city. There would be growing travel by car, bus, coach and train services. We're really starting to get into another almost a period of elegance, and the corporation had plans to grow tourism in York. Also important nationally was the Holidays with Pay Act, which enabled people to have paid holidays properly for the first time. The picture on the right, by the way, I think is a railway poster, probably an example from the National Railway Museum. A beautiful image of, as were so many of the railway posters of the era. And another hotel to pick up has had several different names. The Chase Hotel, we'll call it for now, because this is a postcard that the Chase Hotel produced. It relates back to a story I mentioned a few minutes ago, because it originally started as a house called the Hollies, which was the home of Major John Close of the Steel Forge Works on Lehman Road. He used to live in North Lodge, a villa where the Royal York Hotel now stands. So when the railway company built the hotel, they demolished his house, and it was negotiated that they would build a new home for him, the Hollies on Tadcaster Road. It became a hotel in 1928, and its first name was Harker's Hotel. Remember the original Harker's in St Helens Square? Well, the company that owned that hotel, when it was demolished, they moved here. So they called it Harker's, and the name was changed to the Chase in 1948. Those of you who know where this hotel is along Tadcaster Road will know that it backs onto the racecourse. Has the most fantastic aspect, and obviously racecourse owners and so on enjoyed it. And in the middle of this postcard, you'll see the saddle, which many of us regret we can't see any longer, which was a real iconic point of that Tadcaster Road hotel for many, many years. The hotel was later taken over by the Morris Hotels, then the Swallow Group from 1987. It's now part of the Marriott chain, and they've invested heavily in the hotel, which now has 151 bedrooms. So that's a private house that's been expanded many times over the years. That's some examples of how it looks today. Post-war, York tourism continued to grow, and the Castle Museum was especially popular. The first corporation visitor guide was produced, and the Association of Voluntary Guides, which I'm a member of, and John Shaw, who we saw earlier, that was established in 1951. A tourist information centre was opened. I think this is the earliest example, which is basically in St Leonard's Hospital, the famous ruin that you see as you go near to the library. It is watertight, but in the 1950s, it was the Tourist Information Centre. It's a lovely photograph. I think that's from 1958. And other things were going on in York as well. By the 60s, though, it's still to be realistic, we had those great attractions like the National Railway Museum, sorry, not like the local Railway Museum and the Castle Museum, but all the same, the visitor offer was still a bit restricted, especially during the week. There was all sorts of early closing of shops and attractions. They certainly weren't open on Sundays. I think they closed early on Wednesdays, and some did not open on Mondays. The picture at the top is of a guest house. One must remember that as well as hotels, of course, there's a whole range of other types of accommodation. The bed and breakfast and guest house market is still very important to York, as are caravan sites, campsites and the youth hostel. But at the end of the 1960s, only 15% of the accommodation in the visitor guide had private bathrooms. Those were the days where we would all march down the corridor with our dressing gown and our towels in order to go to the bathroom. Those were the days in the 1960s. And as I say, the shops closed early. The season of tourism was really quite short in York. I would think 16 weeks, probably from Easter through to the end of August. And school groups and families were dominant. I've put another photograph up of the Castle Museum because I know that many of you who are from York will probably, your first experience of a museum would have been the Castle Museum from school trips. Really, really impressive, the museum, of course, still today. And proportionately, very few overseas visitors compared to the way we expect to see York today. I like my stats, so here's another one. Guest accommodation in 1963, only one hotel had over 50 bedrooms. That was the Royal Station, Royal York, if you want to call it that. And there were only 7 others had even over 20 bedrooms. The Chase, which I've talked about, the Dean Court, which I might talk about, the Elm Bank, which is on Tadcaster, or the Mount, which is in the photograph today, that's still with us. The White Swan, which closed around 1970 and which is now flats with retail below. Granby Lodge, the Abbey Park Hotel, that's still with us, but it's now called Ibis. It's on Tadcaster Road, again, the Mount, really. And York Motel, which I think is opposite the church in Dringhouses on Tadcaster Road. And even that only had 20 bedrooms. The majority of guest accommodation in the 60s and 70s was still very much otherwise the bed and breakfast and guest house market. And we have a lot to be thankful for the marvellous people that ran these establishments. By the 1970s, a Department of Tourism had been founded in the council, and the attractions were starting to grow. The National Railway Museum was established in 1975, and the massive success of the Coppergate dig, 500,000 visitors altogether, and they're featured in those photographs. There was also a major anniversary of York's foundation in the year 1971, which brought a year of celebrations in the city. And hotels were starting to spring up, new ones. I think at the end of the 60s, you had 2. That in particular, you've got the Viking Hotel as it was. It's now called the Park Inn. And the Post House Hotel, which is obviously that was an important feature at the time as well. Now the Holiday Inn. There's an advertisement there. From September 1971, you'll have a brand new post house at Dringhouses. And that's, as I say, that hotel is very much still with us, but it's a Holiday Inn now. On we go. Oh, there we go. So another hotel, and this is Lady Anne Middleton's hotel. This also is another hotel that links to the 1970s. The building is an awful lot older than that. Then called Lady Anne Middleton's Hotel, now just called Middleton's. There's basically 56 hotel rooms spread across 6 different buildings in a little complex of historical buildings, many of which are listed buildings as well. Lady Anne House, Cromwell House, Chaplain House, Sir Joseph Terry Cottages, 56 Skeldergate, and the Organ Factory for the making of church organs. All historic Grade 2 or Grade 2 star buildings. The centrepiece, I guess, is Lady Anne House, taken its name from late Dame Anne Middleton, who was the wife of the Sheriff of York in 1659, Peter Middleton, and funded a hospital with an endowment. There's an image of Dame Anne or Lady Anne, as you can see, in the centrepiece of the building in front of us. The hospital was rebuilt and extended in 1829, but was nearly derelict by 1972, and hence was incorporated by the owners of one of the other buildings purchased and basically then started to set about creating a hotel out of all of these different buildings. There's 56 Skeldergate dates from 1777 to 1779. Another Cromwell House was a sawmill in the Industrial Revolution times. The cottages were memorial homes, I suppose almshouses. And as I said, the organ factory was an organ builder who retired in 1921. It's Victorian, and it's another grade 2 listed building which is used for weddings and conferences. So Lady Anne Middleton's Hotel, that was opened, I think, 1973. And there's some more images of some of the other parts of the hotel, which is certainly still open today. I think I've lost track of all the rules and regulations, but I know that some of the hotels will be able to reopen fairly soon. 80s and 90s, we've got big investments and tourism really starts to take off in a big way. You've got the Jorvik Viking Centre, of huge importance really, developing on from the Coppergate dig. Nearly 1 million visitors a year, a real sensation for York, and almost changing the image of York from its Roman history to very much an emphasis on the Viking history, and many other attractions were established as well. There was massive hotel building going on, an events program started to emerge, and conference marketing for the first time. Business and conference tourism is now an important feature of the visitor offer for the city. And the foot streets, of course, were created, closing many of the city centre streets to cars, during the heart of the day, enabling a much better, much safer environment for pedestrians. And one of the properties that also opened as a hotel in the 80s is Middlethorpe Hall. Just to the south of York, built in around about the year 1700 as a manor house for a Sheffield ironmaster called Thomas Barlow. There was previously a country house before this, which was built earlier in the 17th century. The manor of Middlethorpe was bought for £1,250. And Thomas Barlow built the present Middlethorpe Hall in 3 years. The halls had all sorts of different owners. The Barlow family owned the property for over 100 years. It was then rented out to private individuals. It became a boarding school for girls for a while. It was sold to a pig breeder and gardener at the start of the 20th century. Later, in 1972, the ground floor rooms became a nightclub called Brummels, and some of the people watching this talk may well remember the nightclub. In 1972 to 1980, quite an extraordinary use of a 1700 building. It was bought in 1980 by Historic House Hotels to be converted into a hotel. That's not just the house, but the gardens itself. There was a hell of a lot of work to do in restoring the house. The position now is it has 29 guest rooms and suites, and the old stables and courtyard were restored also, as well as the main house itself. Personally, I think the gardens and the grounds are absolutely fantastic. And the great thing is, because it's now a National Trust property, you can certainly go and visit Middlethorpe Hall when it's open. But I do recommend tea on the terrace, just a cup of tea or coffee if you're watching the pennies. But the grounds are fantastic. And look at the picture of the tree on the right. Isn't that splendid? Middlethorpe Hall. The other side of York in terms of hotels in the 1980s was the new hotels. And the picture is here is of the Novotel, opened in 1987, 146 bedrooms. The picture on the left is what it was there before. It was Redfern National Glass, once one of York's most important industries. York's been making glass for over 200 years. But the industry closed down in 1983, the end of 1983, and the hotel and housing associated with it was built in 1987. Nevertheless, the Novotel is an interesting hotel because there are some fantastic views through the hotel and also from the terrace at the other side of the hotel where you can see the River Foss. So an interesting place, but certainly a symbol of change in York from industry to the service sector. And a quick reference to conferences and meetings. I mentioned this before. Of the 8 million visitors who come to York each in 2018, about 1 million of them were on conferences and meetings. The business sector is really important, but of course is likely to be one of the sectors most grievously affected by what we're doing. Meetings and seminars and the like on Zoom rather than people necessarily having to meet in person. The reason I chose this photograph is that John Cleese was associated at those days with a company called Video Arts that made management training schemes. I have a feeling that John Cleese once played a very famous hotelier. I think you all know who I'm getting at. And let's move on finally to the 21st century. All sorts of change here. And really the pace of change has been faster and faster, and certainly in terms of hotel development, as well as all sorts of other aspects of the city of York. Events and festivals programmed right throughout the year, huge investment in attractions, the growth of out of town and city centre budget hotels, the Premier Inn and Travelodge type chains, quite extraordinary. And of course, that's had a major impact on, I suspect, above all, the bed and breakfast and guest house trade. York's also been celebrating its first 5-star hotel, and with all sorts of other investment, including the new visitor information centre, which opened in 2010, and all sorts of other promotional activity. Tourism has really taken off as such an important industry in the city. And look at the size of the hotels. Remember that previous chart showing 1963? Well, by 2020, in 1963, there was one hotel with over 50 bedrooms. It happened to have over 100 bedrooms. In 2020, there are now 16. It's just escalated so much. An extraordinary turnover, a changeover, and of course Malmaison is under construction as we speak, near to the Grand Hotel, which was originally the Cedar Court Grand. This is a montage of some of the hotels that have opened in the last few years. The Holiday Inn on Piccadilly, Rooms, double Z, which is in Clementhorpe, the Travelodge in Piccadilly as well, the Grand, which I'm going to talk about, and the Stay City Apartments, which is next to the Barbican Centre on Paragon Street. Extraordinary changes to the hotel landscape in York. And the Grand, must mention this as York's first 5-star hotel, and again another wonderful link to the railway industry and even to good old Scorewinds Hotel, because the building that the Grand occupies was built in 1906 as the Palace of Business for the North Eastern Railway Company, which was one of the richest businesses in Britain apparently at the time. A spectacular development, which, as I say, created by the design carried out by William Bell and by Horace Field, who carried out many external embellishments to the hotel, to the offices, I should say, because this, as I say, this was started off as the railway offices for the North Eastern Railway. An incredible place. The interior of the building has high ceilings, tall windows, lofty arches, and wide open corridors and spaces. And but basically it closed down just after the year 2000, and for a while was being considered as a major new hotel opportunity. Company took it on and called it the Cedar Court, now the Grand, and it opened in 2010, 207 bedrooms and it's York's first 5-star hotel. An absolutely fantastic and an extraordinary place with wonderful detailing as well. On the picture on the left, I'm just thinking that you've got the Grand on the left-hand side. On the right, you've got the corner of the original Royal Station Hotel, which is now part of the West Offices. And in the middle distance, you've got what was actually 37 Tanner Row. So again, was an original railway hotel back in the 1850s. But this is now, as I say, York's 5-star hotel. And so to the future. Well, what's going to happen next? Heaven knows. There's clearly the changing face of York, the future of retailing. I put this slide together before the sad news today that apparently John Lewis is closing its store up at Clifton. Sorry, at Monk's Cross. You've got the international events, the massive international impact of coronavirus and Brexit. But coronavirus has been so serious in terms of certainly the tourism and hospitality and the overall hotel situation. And clearly we're trying to feel our way out of this terrible crisis that's engulfed the country, with all the terrible human casualty as well. You've got other patterns, the unstoppable chains that I've mentioned, the travel lodges and Premier Inns, but also Airbnb and other new methods of marketing and promoting guest accommodation in the city. The photograph indicates the concept of virtual reality versus actual reality. It's a bit like me being a virtual reality person at the moment. There's maybe in the future a chance to look at Green York. I mentioned parks and gardens ages ago, but they're still with us and they're still fantastic. The Museum Gardens is the most wonderful place. The grounds of Middlethorpe Hall are fantastic. Even the smaller parks, they're great places. And perhaps Green York is something that can be promoted. The big schemes, of course, coming up, the Castle Gateway and York Central. Who knows what the developments will be there. And there is the concept of alternative York. And that means challenging and looking up at all sorts of things, whether it's the, LGBTQ agenda. It's got to be Black Lives Matter, York's role in terms of certain awkward questions, awkward issues, but they're interesting issues too. People are frightened of all of these changes, but actually some of them might be very, very exciting and very, very interesting. And of course, there's obviously the issue of engaging the local community as well. So that's some of the things that I wanted to mention today. And very briefly, as a postscript, if I've got time, a couple of additional slides for one of my favourite hotels, which is the Dean Court Hotel, close to the Minster, the most fantastic position, built in 1865 as 3 separate houses to house clergy of the Minster, and it's situated on the corner of Petergate. It became a hotel sometime later, probably during the 1930s. I think it became, the Thwaites family bought the middle section of the place and had opened it up to paying guests. It became the Dean Court, I think, around about 1986. There's been different owners of the building over the years, but the Dean Court is a fantastic place. There's a little cottage that went with it. That was a separate sort of guest house, really, in the 1930s called Volans. It's now all part of the same hotel. And a final picture of it with the Minster and the famous hanging baskets and flowers that they put outside the hotel. As I say, the Dean Court is one of my personal favourites, but there are plenty of other hotels to enjoy and to see, which are well worth visiting around the city.